In a vibrant city, teeming with tourists and locals, there was a place everyone knew well. A palace that stood tall, its golden gates a symbol of history and grandeur. Every day, tourists from all corners of the world arrived to admire its beauty, eager to capture memories in their cameras. Among the sea of visitors was a young tourist who seemed just like any other, with a backpack slung over his shoulder and an eager smile on his face. He wandered through the streets, excited about the new place he was exploring. This wasn't just any vacation for him. It was a journey into the unknown, an adventure he had dreamed of for years. The city had its own rhythm, the way the people spoke, the foods that filled the air with tempting aromas, and the vibrant market stalls. But what caught his attention most was the magnificent palace he had heard so much about. As he made his way closer to the palace, the sight of the royal guard standing at attention caught his eye. The guard, dressed in a sharp uniform, stood still as a statue, his gaze fixed ahead. It wasn't uncommon for tourists to stop and stare. Many of them would take photos, sometimes trying to sneak a closer look. But there was something about the guard's presence that felt different, something imposing and dignified that commanded respect. The tourist, however, wasn't aware of the strict cultural customs that surrounded the royal guards. He thought of them as just another part of the scenery, like the beautiful architecture or the grand fountains. His thoughts weren't malicious. He wasn't thinking of disrespecting anyone. He simply didn't understand the deeper meaning behind a guard's position. He believed he could casually approach and have a little fun, maybe even snap a photo up close. With a carefree attitude, the tourist walked up to the guard, hoping to get the perfect picture. He wasn't nervous. In fact, he had an amused look on his face. As he stood in front of the guard, he made a joke, not realizing that this small, seemingly innocent gesture might not be so harmless. He felt no need to keep his distance, thinking that a simple interaction couldn't hurt. The guard remained still, his face unchanging. He had heard all sorts of remarks from tourists, some of them playful, others annoying. But this one felt different. Though the guard didn't move or react, there was a subtle shift in his posture. He wasn't just a figure standing there. He was an official with a duty that carried deep respect in the eyes of the locals. The tourist, still oblivious, took a few more steps toward the guard, feeling the excitement of the moment. His confidence grew as he jokingly nudged the guard's arm, laughing at the absurdity of the situation. He thought the guard would respond in some way, maybe even laugh. But nothing happened. The guard's eyes remained forward, his silence only adding to the tension. Despite the seriousness of the moment, the tourist still didn't sense the gravity of the situation. He simply thought it was all part of the experience, unaware that what he was doing had far greater implications than he realized. He continued to smile, thinking that he was just one more tourist enjoying the sights of the city. Little did he know, the consequences of his actions were about to unfold in ways he could never have imagined. As the tourist took another step forward, something inside him urged him to go a little further. He was still smiling, still unaware of the tension in the air. He thought maybe he could get an even closer photo. The guard remained perfectly still, his body as rigid as a statue. But the tourist, caught up in his own excitement, didn't notice the small, subtle change in the atmosphere. He reached out, his hand moving in the air, and with a quick motion, he lightly slapped the guard on the arm. It was meant as a playful gesture, something to get a reaction, perhaps to make a funny memory for his trip. The slap wasn't hard, just a light tap, but it broke the silence in an instant. The guard's expression didn't change. His eyes were still forward, his face calm, as if he had expected something like this to happen, though he remained motionless. But something had shifted. The slap, though seemingly harmless to the tourist, had crossed a line. It wasn't just a tourist messing around anymore. It was an act that touched on something far more important than a simple interaction. It was an insult, an offense, in the eyes of those who respected the traditions of the royal guard. The tourist, still thinking it was all in good fun, chuckled nervously. He was expecting a laugh, maybe even a scolding, but not what was coming next. Without saying a word, the guard turned slightly, his hand signaling to a nearby officer. The tourist's heart skipped a beat. He thought maybe the guard was just going to ask him to step back, but instead, the officer walked toward him with a firm expression on his face. The sudden arrival of the officer startled the tourist, and the playful smile on his face began to fade. He could feel the tension in the air, but still, he didn't fully understand what was happening. The officer didn't say anything at first, but his presence was enough to make the tourist feel uneasy. The guard remained silent, still standing at attention, his eyes now scanning the crowd that had begun to gather around. The tourist could feel eyes on him, and he realized that something serious was unfolding, but he still wasn't sure what exactly. Was it just a misunderstanding? Had the situation escalated too quickly? The officer's expression remained stern as he moved closer. The tourist's laughter faded, replaced by a growing sense of discomfort. He tried to speak, offering an apology, but the words caught in his throat. His mind raced as he began to realize the gravity of what he had done. The slap in his eyes had been a light-hearted action, but to the guard, to the officers, and to the local people, it was far more than that. Still, the officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked to the guard, who gave a slight nod. It was a small gesture, but it sent a clear message. Without a word being exchanged, the officer grabbed the tourist by the arm, guiding him away from the royal guard. The gathering crowd whispered in hushed tones as the situation became even more tense. The tourist's face turned pale as he was led away, still trying to process what had just happened. The moment the officer began leading the tourist away, the crowd that had gathered around the royal guard seemed to ripple with quiet murmurs. People watched curiously, some with expressions of concern, others with disbelief. The tourist, now feeling the weight of what had just happened, felt his heart pound faster with every step. He had no idea what was coming next, but it was clear that this was no small matter. As he was guided through the streets, the tourist's mind raced. He kept glancing over his shoulder, seeing the royal guard still standing at his post, unmoving. The guard's face was unreadable, but the sight of him standing so still, like an immovable statue, only added to the unease the tourist was feeling. He had imagined a different outcome. Perhaps the guard would have scolded him, maybe even laughed off the whole thing. But instead, it felt like he had touched something much bigger, something that went far beyond a mere joke. The officer's firm grip on his arm didn't let up. The tourist opened his mouth, trying to explain, trying to apologize for his actions, but every time he tried to speak, the officer just shook his head slightly, not allowing him to finish. The officer's expression was serious, and his silence spoke volumes. The tourist's mind was a whirl of confusion, wondering if there was any way out of this situation, or if it was already too late to fix. They reached a nearby building, the local police station, and the tourist's stomach sank. The sight of the police officers waiting inside only confirmed his growing fear. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. The atmosphere was heavy, and he realized that his carefree moment of fun had led him to a much darker place. The officers didn't seem angry, but they were certainly not treating the incident lightly. Inside the station, the tourist was asked to sit down in a small room. He couldn't stop thinking about the royal guard and how quickly the situation had spiraled out of control. The officer who had escorted him didn't speak much, only nodding toward the officer in charge, who sat across from the tourist at the table. There was a brief pause before the officer in charge spoke, his voice calm but firm. "We take disrespect for the royal guard very seriously here," the officer explained. The tourist tried to respond, to explain that he didn't mean any harm, but the officer held up a hand, stopping him. "The royal guard is a symbol of our tradition and respect," he continued. "What you did was more than just a joke." The words hit the tourist hard. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was an offense, one that carried a significance he hadn't known about. His apology felt hollow now, but he still tried to explain himself. He didn't know the culture, didn't understand the deep respect that was demanded of the royal guard. But it was clear that his lack of awareness didn't change the consequences. Outside the small room, the whispers of the gathering crowd still echoed in the tourist's ears. He realized now that his actions had been witnessed, and what he had done would likely become a bigger story. The eyes of the locals and tourists alike were on him, and the tourist couldn't help but feel the weight of judgment coming from every direction. As the minutes stretched on, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was in a foreign country, far from home, and the consequences of a single action were starting to feel more real than ever. His mind wandered to what would happen next, but one thing was clear. He was no longer in control of the situation. The officers were not showing any signs of letting him go. They were serious, and the gravity of what he had done was something he had never expected to face. As the minutes ticked by in the small, dimly lit room, the tourist's anxiety grew. His heart beat faster with every passing second, his mind racing with thoughts of how things had gotten so out of hand. What was meant to be a lighthearted moment had quickly turned into something far more serious, and now he found himself trapped in a situation he didn't understand. The walls of the room seemed to close in on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had taken an unexpected turn. Outside, the sounds of the busy city filtered through the thin walls, a stark contrast to the tense silence in the room. The officer who had escorted him remained standing, his expression unreadable, while the officer in charge sat across from the tourist, quietly observing him. The tourist couldn't help but feel the weight of their eyes, their silent judgment. It was as if every second in this room was stretching into eternity. Finally, the officer in charge broke the silence. His voice was calm but firm as he spoke, explaining that the tourist's actions were not being taken lightly. You may not understand the significance of what you've done, but here, respect is sacred. The Royal Guard is not just a person in uniform. They represent our history, our values, and our way of life. The tourist nodded, his throat dry. He wanted to speak, to apologize again, but the words didn't come. He had realized by now that it wasn't just about a slap. It was about something deeper, something that he had failed to grasp in his naivety. His actions, however unintended, had insulted a symbol of national pride, and that was not something that could be brushed off. You are in serious trouble, the officer continued, his tone softening slightly but still filled with authority. The law here is clear. Offenses like yours are not taken lightly, and the consequences are severe. The tourist felt a sinking feeling in his chest. He had been hoping that maybe it was all a misunderstanding, that they would let him go with a warning or some small fine. But as the officer spoke, it became clear that wasn't going to happen. The tourist tried to gather his thoughts, his mind scrambling to think of a way out. I didn't mean any harm, the tourist finally managed to say, his voice shaky. I didn't know. I didn't realize it was such a big deal. I'm really sorry. The officer gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging his apology, but his face remained serious. Sorry isn't enough in this case, he replied. You will have to answer for your actions. It's the law. As the tourist sat there, the weight of the officer's words hung heavily in the air. The world outside seemed so far away now, and he began to wonder how long it would be before he could go home. Would he be able to go home at all? The thought that his careless mistake could cost him his freedom started to feel all too real. For what felt like an eternity, the officer in charge spoke to his colleagues in hushed tones, discussing what the next steps would be. The tourist was left to sit in silence, his mind racing. He couldn't believe how quickly things had escalated. One moment, he was having a light-hearted interaction with the Royal Guard, and the next, he found himself facing the possibility of serious consequences. After what felt like hours, the officer turned back to the tourist. You'll be taken to the court for a hearing. The decision will be made there, but be aware you are facing a serious charge, and the punishment could be severe. The tourist's heart dropped. His mind was reeling as the officer's words sank in. There was no turning back now. He had crossed a line he hadn't even known existed, and now he would have to face the consequences, whatever they might be. The tourist was escorted out of the small room and into the street, where the bustle of the city felt like a distant memory. Everything seemed surreal now, like the world around him was moving in slow motion. The weight of the officer's words, "The punishment could be severe," echoed in his mind with every step he took. He had no idea what would happen next, but the anxiety gnawing at his stomach told him it wouldn't be anything good. As they approached the courthouse, the tourist couldn't help but notice how the city, which had once seemed so welcoming and vibrant, now appeared cold and distant. The towering buildings, the crowded markets, and the laughing children in the streets, all of it felt so far removed from the situation he was now trapped in. It was as if he had crossed some invisible line, and everything that had once been familiar now felt foreign and hostile. He was led into the courthouse, a large, imposing building that seemed to cast a shadow over everything around it. The interior was quiet, almost too quiet, with the sound of footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The tourist's nerves were on edge as he was guided into a small courtroom. It was a modest room, with a few wooden benches and a raised platform where the judge sat. The air was thick with tension, and the tourist couldn't help but feel that every eye in the room was on him. The judge, an older man with a stern face, sat behind the desk, reviewing a pile of papers in front of him. The officers who had escorted the tourist stood at attention nearby, while a few other people, perhaps witnesses or legal advisors, waited quietly in their seats. The tourist, standing nervously at the front of the room, could hardly breathe. The reality of what was happening was beginning to settle in. He had no idea how to handle this situation, or even what to expect. The judge looked up, his gaze piercing as he addressed the room. "This case involves a violation of our country's respect for our royal guard," he said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "It is important to understand that the actions of the accused have consequences that reach beyond a single incident. It is a matter of national pride and respect for our traditions." The tourist's stomach twisted. He had heard these words before, but hearing them now, in this official setting, made them feel much heavier. He didn't know how to respond. Should he apologize again? Should he try to explain? All he knew was that he had made a mistake, a huge mistake, and now there was no easy way to undo it. His defense lawyer, a man he barely knew, stood up and began to speak on his behalf. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, "my client did not fully understand the significance of his actions. He is a foreigner, new to the culture, and did not know that such an act would be seen as disrespectful. We ask for your understanding and for a lesser punishment, given the circumstances." The tourist was grateful for the lawyer's words, but they didn't bring him much comfort. He could see the judge's stern expression, and he knew that this wasn't going to be an easy case. The lawyer spoke about the tourist's lack of knowledge of the local customs and how he had no ill intentions. But in the back of the tourist's mind, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough. The prosecutor, standing at the other side of the room, spoke next. "While we acknowledge that the accused may not have understood the gravity of his actions, we cannot ignore the disrespect shown to one of our most respected institutions. The Royal Guard is a symbol of our history and our values. No one, regardless of their origin, should be allowed to disrespect them." The words stung. The tourist had never meant to insult anyone, especially not the Royal Guard, who he now understood held such deep significance to the people of this country. But the prosecutor's words were clear. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. He had done something that, to the people here, couldn't be taken lightly. The judge listened intently, his eyes never leaving the tourist as the arguments unfolded. The tourist's mind raced, but all he could think about was how to make things right. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen. All he wanted was to have a memorable experience, not to end up standing in a courtroom, fighting for his freedom. Finally, the judge spoke again, his voice unwavering. "The law is clear. Disrespecting the royal guard is a serious offense. However, given the accused's lack of understanding, we will take that into consideration. The tourist held his breath, hoping that the judge might show mercy, but he had a sinking feeling that the outcome wouldn't be in his favor. The proceedings continued, but in the tourist's mind, time seemed to move in slow motion. He couldn't focus on the words being spoken. All he could think about was the weight of the decision that would soon be made. The courtroom fell silent as the judge deliberated. The tourist could hear his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears as he waited for the decision. The room felt unnervingly still, the tension so thick that it seemed almost suffocating. He had tried to hold on to hope, but the weight of the prosecutor's words and the seriousness in the judge's eyes made it clear that this was not a trivial matter. As the minutes passed, the judge slowly lowered the papers he had been reading and fixed his gaze on the tourist. It was a stare that seemed to pierce through him, and the tourist couldn't help but feel small and insignificant under it. He wished he could go back in time to stop himself from approaching the royal guard, to erase the slap that had led him to this moment. But there was no going back. All he could do now was wait. The judge cleared his throat before speaking, his voice steady but filled with authority. The court has reviewed the evidence, and it is clear that the actions of the accused, while not malicious, were a violation of our customs and laws. While we understand that he did not intend harm, the act itself carries significant consequences in our culture. Respect for the royal guard is not just a matter of etiquette, but a symbol of the unity and pride of our people. The tourist's stomach tightened as he listened to the judge's words. It was as if everything he had hoped for, some leniency, some chance to explain himself, was slipping further away. He had tried so hard to make the situation clear, to show that it had been an innocent mistake, but the reality of the legal system was harsh. The weight of tradition, of honor, was not something he could have easily understood in his brief time in the country. The judge continued, considering the circumstances and the fact that the accused is a foreigner who may not have been fully aware of the seriousness of his actions, the court has decided to impose a sentence that reflects the gravity of the offense while also acknowledging his lack of intent to cause harm. The tourist held his breath, praying that the judge would show mercy. He tried to focus on the judge's words, searching for any sign of hope, but the room felt like it was closing in on him. The sentence for the offense of disrespecting the royal guard is 5 years in prison. The judge finally announced, his voice sharp and final. The words hit the tourist like a punch to the gut. 5 years. His mind couldn't process it at first. He had heard the term severe punishment mentioned before, but to actually hear it, 5 long years, felt like a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. His hands began to tremble, and for a moment, he could barely hear the murmurs of the room as the reality of the sentence settled in. He felt his world spin out of control. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had expected a fine, or perhaps a brief detention, but not this. 5 years was an eternity, and it seemed so far removed from the mistake he had made. He hadn't meant to insult anyone. He hadn't meant to disrespect the guard or the culture. It had been a moment of poor judgment, a harmless act, but now it seemed that all of that had been irrelevant. The room felt colder as the judge's words echoed in the tourist's ears. The 5-year sentence was final. The judge turned his attention to the officers present in the courtroom, signaling that the proceedings were concluded. The tourist, still trying to process what had just happened, was led out of the room, his legs unsteady beneath him. As he was escorted through the courthouse, the tourist's mind was a blur of thoughts. He kept replaying the events in his head, wondering if there was anything he could have done differently. What could he have said? What could he have done to change the outcome? But it was too late for regrets now. The sentence had been handed down, and there was nothing more he could do. The officers led him out of the courthouse, and the sounds of the city, once lively and full of possibility, now felt distant. The streets seemed to blur as he walked, his future uncertain and clouded with the weight of his punishment. He tried to hold back the rising panic within him, but it was impossible to ignore the crushing reality of the situation. 5 years was an unimaginable sentence, and he had no idea how he was going to face it. The days following the trial felt like a blur to the tourist. The weight of the sentence loomed over him, making everything seem distant and unreal. He was taken to the prison, a place far removed from the lively streets of the city where he had once walked freely. The prison's walls were high and imposing, a stark reminder of the consequences he now had to face. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of regret as he walked through the gates, escorted by guards who kept a close eye on him. This wasn't the vacation he had imagined, not the adventure he had hoped for. Instead of exploring a new country, he now found himself imprisoned in a foreign land, facing an uncertain future. The prison was much different from what he had imagined. The walls were thick, and the air was heavy with the smell of dust and dampness. The atmosphere was quiet, but it wasn't a peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel as though the weight of the place was pressing down on you. The tourist was led down a long corridor, passing by cells where the prisoners looked up at him with curious, calculating eyes. He was ushered into a small, stark room with nothing but a narrow bed and a single window high up on the wall. There was no luxury here, no comfort, just the barest essentials. As he sat down on the bed, the reality of the situation started to sink in. He had made one mistake, one impulsive action, and now he was paying the price. He had tried to explain himself in court, but it hadn't been enough. His lack of understanding about the culture, about the deep respect that the royal guard commanded, had only been seen as an excuse. It wasn't a justification for his actions, and now there was no way to change what had already happened. 5 years. It seemed like an eternity, and it was hard to imagine how he would survive the years ahead. At first, the tourist felt isolated, completely alone in this foreign place. He couldn't speak the language fluently, and the guards communicated with him in short, stern words that he barely understood. He tried to reach out, but the people around him seemed distant, uninterested. They, too, were in their own world, consumed by the struggles of their own lives. It was clear that no one had any interest in his story or his situation. To them, he was just another foreigner in a foreign place, someone who had crossed a line that was unforgivable. But over time, something began to change. The tourist started to pay attention, to observe the rhythms of prison life. He began to understand the unspoken rules that governed the daily routine. Slowly, he learned how to navigate the prison, how to find a way to make it through the day. It wasn't easy, but he began to adapt. He started to make small connections with some of the other prisoners. At first, they kept their distance, but as the days turned into weeks, the tourist began to build a fragile rapport with a few of them. They shared small conversations, exchanged stories of life outside the prison walls, and slowly the tourist started to feel like he wasn't completely alone. Still, the sense of isolation remained, especially in the quiet moments when he had time to think. He would often lie on his narrow bed, staring up at the high, barred window, wondering if there was any way he could ever make it out. The long years stretched out before him, and he couldn't help but think of his family and friends back home. How would they react when they found out what had happened to him? Would they even understand why it had all gone so wrong? One day, as he was walking along the narrow corridor, one of the guards stopped him. The guard didn't speak much, but his expression seemed to soften just a little. He had seen the tourist struggling, trying to adjust to the harsh realities of prison life. "You'll survive," the guard said, his voice quiet but reassuring. "It's not easy here, but it's not the end either. You'll learn how to make it through." The words were simple, but they meant something to the tourist. They were a small comfort, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. He didn't know if he would ever get out of this place, or if he would have to serve the entire sentence, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he might be able to make it through. Perhaps in time, he could find a way to come to terms with what had happened. Perhaps there was still a way to rebuild his life, even if it had been shattered by a single mistake. The road ahead was uncertain, But the tourist realized that he wasn't completely without hope. He might not be able to change the past, but he could still shape his future, one day at a time. Months passed, and the tourist's life in prison became a strange blend of routine and reflection. The days started to blur together, with each one feeling like the last. The weight of the 5-year sentence was ever present, but as time went on, he began to learn how to live with it. The harshness of the prison faded into the background, and he found small ways to adjust to his new reality. He became better at understanding the language, allowing him to communicate more with the other prisoners and guards. Slowly, the walls that had once seemed so impenetrable began to feel less suffocating. He started to find meaning in the smallest of things: a shared smile with another prisoner, the exchange of a book, a quiet conversation in the yard. These were the moments that helped him survive. Life in prison was never easy, but these small human connections were what kept him grounded. He began to see that the people around him were not so different from him. Many of them had their own struggles, their own regrets, and their own stories. They had made their own mistakes, just like he had. Over time, the tourist came to understand that he wasn't alone in this place. He wasn't the only one paying for a decision that had changed his life. The realization that he was not the only one with a heavy burden was both humbling and comforting. It gave him a sense of solidarity with the others, a reminder that even in the darkest of places, people could still find ways to connect, to share their experiences, and to help each other. The tourist started to see his time in prison differently. Instead of viewing it solely as a punishment, he began to view it as an opportunity for growth. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the loneliness and regret would wash over him. But he learned to face those feelings head-on, to confront them instead of running from them. One day, several months into his sentence, the tourist was called to the warden's office. His heart skipped a beat as he followed the guards down the corridor, unsure of what to expect. Had something gone wrong? Was his behavior in prison being questioned? When he entered the office, the warden was sitting behind a large desk, papers spread out before him. There was a serious look on the warden's face, but there was something else in his eyes, a kind of understanding. "Your situation has been reviewed," the warden said, his voice calm but firm. "There's a possibility for you to reduce your sentence through good behavior and rehabilitation. It's not a guarantee, but there's a chance." The tourist's mind raced. Could it be true? Was there a way out of this after all? The warden explained that if he continued to show progress, both in his behavior and his understanding of the culture, there might be a chance for an early release. It wasn't easy, and it would take time, but it was a glimmer of hope, something that had seemed so far out of reach when he had first been sentenced. As the tourist left the warden's office, a wave of emotions hit him. Relief, hope, disbelief, all mixed together. He couldn't let himself get too excited, but the possibility of a future beyond these walls was enough to keep him going. He wasn't giving up on himself anymore. The road ahead might still be long, but now he had something to work toward. Over the next several months, the tourist focused on bettering himself. He took part in every program offered, trying to learn more about the local culture and customs. He spent hours reading, writing, and reflecting on his actions. Slowly, he earned the trust of the guards and the other prisoners. He began to teach English to some of the others, using it as a way to connect with them and share what little knowledge he had left. It wasn't much, but it was something. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the day arrived when the tourist was called to the warden's office again. This time, there was a smile on the warden's face. "You've made significant progress," he said. "Your early release has been approved." The tourist could hardly believe it. The weight that had hung over him for so long suddenly lifted, and he felt lighter than he had in years. The moment was surreal, but as he packed his few belongings and walked out of the prison gates, he realized that this chapter of his life had come to an end. He had learned so much about himself, about the world, and about the consequences of his actions. When he stepped out into the sunlight, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had survived. He had made it through, and now he could return home. But he knew that he would never forget the lessons he had learned during those long, dark months. They had shaped him into someone different, someone who understood the true value of respect, patience, and second chances. And as he walked away from the prison, he couldn't help but feel that he had not just been released from the physical walls, but from the emotional ones too.